Section 11 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 5, by Alexandre Dumas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Denham. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 5, by Alexandre Dumas, Section 11. There was a moment of silence. This fable, so atrociously ingenious, was simply and impressively narrated, and with an air of candour well contrived to impose on the magistrate, or at least to suggest grave doubts to his mind. Derues, with his usual cunning, had conformed his language to the quality of his listener. Any tricks, profession of piety, quotations from sacred books, so largely indulged in when he wished to bamboozle people of a lower class, would here have told against him. He knew when to abstain, and carried the art of deception far enough to be able to lay aside the appearance of hypocrisy. He had described all the circumstances without affectation, and if this unexpected accusation was wholly unproved, it yet rested on a possible fact, and it did not appear absolutely incredible. The magistrate went through it all again, and made him repeat every detail, without being able to make him contradict himself or show the smallest embarrassment. While interrogating Derues, he kept his eyes fixed upon him, and this double examination being quite fruitless, only increased his perplexity. However, he never relaxed the incredulous severity of his demeanour, nor the imperative and threatening tone of his voice. "You acknowledge having been at Lyons?" he asked. "I have been there." "At the beginning of this examination you said you would explain the reason of this journey later." "I am ready to do so, for the journey is connected with the facts I have just narrated. It was caused by them." "Explain it." "I again ask permission to relate fully. I did not hear from Versailles. I began to fear Monsieur de Lamotte's anxiety would bring him to Paris. Bound by the promise I had made to his wife to avert all suspicion, and to satisfy any doubts he might conceive, and, must I add, also remembering that it was important for me to inform him of our new arrangements, and of this payment of 100,000 livres. "That payment is assuredly fictitious," interrupted Monsieur de Lamotte. "We must have some proof of it." "I will prove it presently," answered Derues. "So I went to Buisson, as I have already told you. On my return I found a letter from Madame de Lamotte, a letter with a Paris stamp, which had arrived that morning. I was surprised that she should write when actually in Paris. I opened the letter and was still more surprised. I have not the letter with me, but I recollect the sense of it perfectly, if not the wording, and I can produce it if necessary. Madame de Lamotte was at Lyons with her son, and this person, whose name I do not know, and whom I do not care to mention before her husband. She had confided this letter to a person who was coming to Paris, and who was to bring it me, but this individual, whose name was Marquis, regretted that, having to start again immediately, he was obliged to entrust it to the post. This is the sense of its contents. Madame de Lamotte wrote that she found herself obliged to follow this nameless person to Lyons, and she begged me to send her news of her husband and of the state of his affairs, but said not one single word of any probable return. I became very uneasy at the news of this clandestine departure. I had no security except a private contract annulling our first agreement on the payment of 100,000 livres, and that this was not a sufficient and regular receipt I knew, because the lawyer had already refused to surrender Monsieur de Lamotte's power of attorney. I thought over all the difficulties which this flight, which would have to be kept secret, was likely to produce, and I started for Lyons without writing or giving any notice of my intention. I had no information. I did not even know whether Madame de Lamotte was passing by another name, as at Versailles, but chance decreed that I met her the very day of my arrival. She was alone and complained bitterly of her fate, saying she had been compelled to follow this individual to Lyons, but that very soon she would be free and would return to Paris. But I was struck by the uncertainty of her manner, and said I should not leave her without obtaining a deed in proof of our recent arrangements. She refused at first, saying it was unnecessary, as she would so soon return, but I insisted strongly. I told her I had already compromised myself by telling Monsieur de Lamotte that she was at Versailles, endeavouring to procure an appointment for her son; that since she had been compelled to come to Lyons, the same person might take her elsewhere, so that she might disappear any day, might leave France without leaving any trace, without any written acknowledgment of her own dishonour, and that when all these falsehoods were discovered, I should appear in the light of an accomplice. I said also that as she had unfortunately lodged in my house in Paris, and had requested me to remove her son from his school, explanations would be required from me, and perhaps I should be accused of this double disappearance. Finally, I declared that if she did not give me some proofs of her existence, willingly or unwillingly, I would go at once to a magistrate. My firmness made her reflect. "My good Monsieur Derues," she said, "I ask your forgiveness for all the trouble I have caused you. I will give you this deed tomorrow. Today it is too late, but come to this same place tomorrow, and you shall see me again." I hesitated, I confess, to let her go. "Ah," she said, grasping my hands, "do not suspect me of intending to deceive you. I swear that I will meet you here at 4 o'clock. It is enough that I have ruined myself, and perhaps my son, without also entangling you in my unhappy fate. Yes, you are right. This deed is important, necessary for you, and you shall have it. But do not show yourself here. If you were seen, I might not be able to do what I ought to do. Tomorrow you shall see me again, I swear it." She then left me. The next day, the 12th of March, I was exact at the rendezvous, and Madame de Lamotte arrived a moment later. She gave me a deed authorising her husband to receive the arrears of 30,000 livres remaining from the purchase money of Buisson-Souef. I endeavoured again to express my opinion of her conduct. She listened in silence, as if my words affected her deeply. We were walking together when she told me she had some business in a house we were passing, and asked me to wait for her. I waited more than an hour, and then discovered that this house, like many others in Lyons, had an exit in another street, and I understood that Madame de Lamotte had escaped by this passage, and that I might wait in vain. Concluding that trying to follow her would be useless, and seeing also that any remonstrance would be made in vain, I returned to Paris, deciding to say nothing as yet, and to conceal the truth as long as possible. I still had hopes, and I did not count on being so soon called on to defend myself. I thought that when I had to speak, it would be as a friend, and not as an accused person. This, sir, is the explanation of my conduct, and I regret that this justification, so easy for myself, should be so cruelly painful for another. You have seen the efforts which I made to defer it." Monsieur de Lamotte had heard this second part of Derues' recital with a more silent indignation. Not that he admitted its probability, but he was confounded by this monstrous imposture, and, as it were, terror-stricken by such profound hypocrisy. His mind revolted at the idea of his wife being accused of adultery, but while he repelled this charge with decision, he saw the confirmation of his secret terrors and presentiments, and his heart sank within him at the prospect of exploring this abyss of iniquity. He was pale, gasping for breath, as though he himself had been the criminal, while scorching tears furrowed his cheeks. He tried to speak, but his voice failed. He wanted to fling back at Derues the names of traitor and assassin, and he was obliged to bear in silence the look of mingled grief and pity which the latter bestowed upon him. The magistrate, calmer and master of his emotions, but tolerably bewildered in this labyrinth of cleverly connected lies, thought it desirable to ask some further questions. "How," said he, "did you obtain this sum of 100,000 livres, which you say you paid over to Madame de Lamotte?" "I have been engaged in business for several years, and have acquired some fortune." "Nevertheless, you have postponed the obligation of making this payment several times, so that Monsieur de Lamotte had begun to feel uneasiness on the subject. This was the chief reason of his wife's coming to Paris." "One sometimes experiences momentary difficulties which presently disappear. You say you have a deed given you at Lyons by Madame de Lamotte, which you were to give to her husband." "It is here." The magistrate examined the deed carefully, and noted the name of the lawyer in whose office it had been drawn up. "You may go," he said at last. "What!" exclaimed Monsieur de Lamotte. Derues stopped, but the magistrate signed to him to go, intimating, however, that he was on no account to leave Paris. "But," said Monsieur de Lamotte, when they were alone, "this man is indeed guilty. My wife has not betrayed me. She, forget her duties as a wife, she was virtue incarnate. Ah, I assure you, these terrible calumnies are invented to conceal double crime. I throw myself at your feet. I implore your justice." "Rise, monsieur. This is only a temporary examination, and I confess that so far he comes well out of it, for imagination can hardly understand such a depth of deceit. I watched him closely the whole time, and I could discover no sign of alarm, no contradiction in either face or language. If guilty, he must be the greatest hypocrite that ever existed. But I shall neglect nothing. If a criminal is allowed to flatter himself with impunity, he frequently forgets to be prudent, and I have seen many betray themselves when they thought they had nothing to fear. Patience and trust to the justice of both God and man." Several days passed, and Derues flattered himself the danger was over. His every action, meanwhile, was most carefully watched, but so that he remained unaware of the surveillance. A police officer named Mutel, distinguished for activity and intelligence beyond his fellows, was charged with collecting information and following any trail. All his bloodhounds were in action, and hunted Paris thoroughly, but could trace nothing bearing on the fate of Madame de Lamotte and her son. Mutel, however, soon discovered that in the Rue Saint-Victor, Derues had failed 3 successive times, that he had been pursued by numerous creditors, and been often near imprisonment for debt, and that in 1771 he had been publicly accused of incendiarism. He reported on these various circumstances, and then went himself to Derues' abode, where he obtained no results. Madame Derues declared that she knew nothing whatever, and the police, having vainly searched the whole house, had to retire. Derues himself was absent. When he returned, he found another order to appear before the magistrate. His first success had encouraged him. He appeared before the magistrate accompanied by a lawyer and full of confidence, complaining loudly that the police, in searching during his absence, had offended against the rights of a domiciled burgess, and ought to have awaited his return. Affecting a just indignation at Monsieur de Lamotte's conduct towards him, he presented a demand that the latter should be declared a calumniator, and should pay damages for the injury caused to his reputation. But this time his effrontery and audacity were of little avail. The magistrate easily detected him in flagrant lies. He declared at first that he had paid the 100,000 livres with his own money, but when reminded of his various bankruptcies, the claims of his creditors, and the judgments obtained against him as an insolvent debtor, he made a complete volte-face, and declared he had borrowed the money from an advocate named Duclos, to whom he had given a bond in presence of a notary. In spite of all his protestations, the magistrate committed him to solitary confinement at Fort l'Évêque. As yet, nothing was publicly known, but vague reports and gossip, carried from shop to shop, circulated among the people, and began to reach the higher classes of society. The infallible instinct which is aroused among the masses is truly marvellous. A great crime is committed, which seems at first likely to defeat justice, and the public conscience is aroused. Long before the tortuous folds which envelop the mystery can be penetrated, while it is still sunk in profound obscurity, the voice of the nation, like an excited hive, buzzes around the secret. Though the magistrates doubt, the public curiosity fixes itself and never leaves go. If the criminal's hiding place is changed, it follows the track, points it out, descries it in the gloom. This is what happened on the news of Derues' arrest. The affair was everywhere discussed, although the information was incomplete, reports inexact, and no real publicity to be obtained. The romance which Derues had invented by way of defence, and which became known as well as Monsieur de Lamotte's accusation, obtained no credence whatever. On the contrary, all the reports to his discredit were eagerly adopted. As yet, no crime could be traced, but the public presentiment divined an atrocious one. Have we not often seen similar agitations? The names of Bastide, of Castin, of Papavoine had hardly been pronounced before they completely absorbed all the public attention, and this had to be satisfied. Light had to be thrown on the darkness. Society demanded vengeance. Derues felt some alarm in his dungeon, but his presence of mind and his dissimulation in no wise deserted him, and he swore afresh every day to the truth of his statements. But his last false assertion turned against him. The bond for 100,000 livres, which he professed to have given to Duclos, was a counterfeit, which Duclos had annulled by a sort of counter-declaration made the same day. Another circumstance, intended to ensure his safety, only redoubled suspicion. On April 8th, notes payable to order to the amount of 78,000 livres were received by Monsieur de Lamotte's lawyer, as if coming from Madame de Lamotte. It appeared extraordinary that these notes, which arrived in an ordinary stamped envelope, should not be accompanied by any letter of advice, and suspicion attached to Madame Derues, who hitherto had remained unnoticed. An inquiry as to where the packet had been posted soon revealed the office, distinguished by a letter of the alphabet, and the postmaster described a servant maid who had brought the letter and paid for it. The description resembled the Derues servant, and this girl, much alarmed, acknowledged, after a great deal of hesitation, that she had posted the letter in obedience to her mistress's orders. Whereupon Madame Derues was sent as a prisoner to Fort l'Évêque, and her husband transferred to the Grand Châtelet. On being interrogated, she at length owned that she had sent these notes to Monsieur de Lamotte's lawyer, and that her husband had given them her in an envelope hidden in the soiled linen for which she had brought him clean in exchange. All this certainly amounted to serious presumptive evidence of guilt, and if Derues had shown himself to the multitude, which followed every phase of the investigation with increasing anxiety, 1,000 arms would have willingly usurped the office of the executioner. But the distance thence to actual proof of murder was enormous for the magistracy. Derues maintained his tranquillity, always asserting that Madame de Lamotte and her son were alive, and would clear him by their reappearance. Neither threats nor stratagems succeeded in making him contradict himself, and his assurance shook the strongest conviction. A new difficulty was added to so much uncertainty. A messenger had been sent off secretly with all haste to Lyons. His return was awaited for a test which it was thought would be decisive. One morning Derues was fetched from his prison and taken to a lower hall of the Conciergerie. He received no answers to the questions addressed to his escort, and this silence showed him the necessity of being on his guard, and preserving his imperturbable demeanour, whatever might happen. On arriving, he found the commissioner of police, Mutel, and some other persons. The hall, being very dark, had been illuminated with several torches, and Derues was so placed that the light fell strongly on his face, and was then ordered to look towards a particular part of the hall. As he did so, a door opened, and a man entered. Derues beheld him with indifference, and seeing that the stranger was observing him attentively, he bowed to him as one might bow to an unknown person whose curiosity seems rather unusual. It was impossible to detect the slightest trace of emotion. A hand placed on his heart would not have felt an increased pulsation. Yet this stranger's recognition would be fatal. Mutel approached the newcomer and whispered, "Do you recognise him?" "No, I do not." "Have the kindness to leave the room for a moment. We will ask you to return immediately." This individual was the lawyer in whose office at Lyons the deed had been drawn up, which Derues had signed, disguised as a woman, and under the name of Marie-Françoise Perrier, wife of the Sieur de Lamotte. A woman's garments were brought in, and Derues was ordered to put them on, which he did readily, affecting much amusement. As he was assisted to disguise himself, he laughed, stroked his chin, and assumed mincing airs, carrying effrontery so far as to ask for a mirror. "I should like to see if it is becoming," he said. "Perhaps I might make some conquests." The lawyer returned. Derues was made to pass before him, to sit at a table, sign a paper, in fact, to repeat everything it was imagined he might have said or done in the lawyer's office. This second attempt at identification succeeded no better than the first. The lawyer hesitated, then, understanding all the importance of his deposition, he refused to swear to anything, and finally declared that this was not the person who had come to him at Lyons. "I am sorry, sir," said Derues, as they removed him, "that you have been troubled by having to witness this absurd comedy. Do not blame me for it, but ask Heaven to enlighten those who do not fear to accuse me. As for me, knowing that my innocence will shortly be made clear, I pardon them henceforth." Although justice at this period was generally expeditious, and the lives of accused persons were by no means safeguarded as they are now, it was impossible to condemn Derues in the absence of any positive proofs of guilt. He knew this, and waited patiently in his prison for the moment when he should triumph over the capital accusation which weighed against him. The storm no longer thundered over his head. The most terrible trials were past, the examinations became less frequent, and there were no more surprises to dread. The lamentations of Monsieur de Lamotte went to the hearts of the magistrates, but his certainty could not establish theirs, and they pitied but could not avenge him. In certain minds a sort of reaction favourable to the prisoner began to set in. Among the dupes of Derues' seeming piety, many who at first held their peace under these crushing accusations returned to their former opinion. The bigots and devotees, all who made a profession of kneeling in the churches, of publicly crossing themselves and dipping their fingers in the holy water, and who lived on cant and repetitions of Amen and Hallelujah, talked of persecution, of martyrdom, until Derues nearly became a saint destined by the Almighty to find canonization in a dungeon. Hence arose quarrels and arguments, and this abortive trial, this unproved accusation, kept the public imagination in a constant ferment. To the greater part of those who talk of the Supreme Being, and who expect his intervention in human affairs, Providence is only a word, solemn and sonorous, a sort of theatrical machine which sets all right in the end, and which they glorify with a few banalities proceeding from the lips, but not from the heart. It is true that this unknown and mysterious cause, which we call God or chance, often appears so exceedingly blind and deaf that one may be permitted to wonder whether certain crimes are really set apart for punishment when so many others apparently go scot-free. How many murders remain buried in the night of the tomb? How many outrageous and avowed crimes have slept peacefully in an insolent and audacious prosperity? We know the names of many criminals, but who can tell the number of unknown and forgotten victims? The history of humanity is twofold, and like that of the invisible world, which contains marvels unexplored by the science of the visible one, the history recounted in books is by no means the most curious and strange. But without delaying over questions such as these, without protesting here against sophistries which cloud the conscience and hide the presence of an avenging deity, we leave the facts to the general judgment, and have now to relate the last episode in this long and terrible drama. Of all the populous quarters of Paris which commented on the affaire Derues, none showed more excitement than that of the Grève, and amongst all the surrounding streets none could boast more numerous crowds than the Rue de la Mortellerie. Not that a secret instinct magnetised the crowd in the very place where the proof lay buried, but that each day its attention was aroused by a painful spectacle. A pale and grief-stricken man, whose eyes seemed quenched in tears, passed often down the street, hardly able to drag himself along. It was Monsieur de Lamotte, who lodged, as we have said, in the Rue de la Mortellerie, and who seemed like a spectre wandering round a tomb. The crowd made way and uncovered before him. Everybody respected such terrible misfortune, and when he had passed, the groups formed up again, and continued discussing the mystery until nightfall. End of section 11. Reading by Tom Denham. Section 12 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 5, by Alexandre Dumas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Denham. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 5, by Alexandre Dumas, Section 12. On April 17th, about 4 in the afternoon, a score of workmen and gossiping women had collected in front of a shop. A stout woman, standing on the lowest step, like an orator in the Tribune, held forth and related for the 20th time what she knew, or rather did not know. There were listening ears and gaping mouths. Even a slight shudder ran through the group, for the widow Masson, discovering a gift of eloquence at the age of 60, contrived to mingle great warmth and much indignation in her recital. All at once silence fell on the crowd, and a passage was made for Monsieur de Lamotte. One man ventured to ask, "Is there anything fresh today?" A sad shake of the head was the only answer, and the unhappy man continued his way. "Is that Monsieur de Lamotte?" inquired a particularly dirty woman, whose cap, stuck on the side of her head, allowed locks of grey hair to straggle from under it. "Ah, is that Monsieur de Lamotte?" "Dear me," said a neighbour, "don't you know him by this time? He passes every day." "Excuse me, I don't belong to this quarter, and no offence, but it is not so beautiful as to bring one out of curiosity. Nothing personal, but it is rather dirty." "Madame is probably accustomed to use a carriage. That would suit you better than me, my dear, and would save you having to buy shoes to keep your feet off the ground." The crowd seemed inclined to hustle the speaker. "Wait a moment," she continued. "I didn't mean to offend anyone. I am a poor woman, but there's no disgrace in that, and I can afford a glass of liqueur. Hey, good gossip, you understand, don't you? A drop of the best for Mother Manifre, and if my fine friend there will drink with me to settle our difference, I will stand her a glass." The example set by the old hawker was contagious, and instead of filling 2 little glasses only, widow Masson dispensed a bottleful. "Come, you have done well," cried Mother Manifre. "My idea has brought you luck. Faith, not before it was wanted either. What? Are you complaining of trade too? Ah, don't mention it. It is miserable. There's no trade at all. I scream myself hoarse all day and choke myself for 2 halfpenny. I don't know what's to come of it all, but you seem to have a nice little custom." "What's the good of that with a whole house on one's hands? It's just my luck. The old tenants go, and the new ones don't come." "What's the matter then?" "I think the devil's in it. There was a nice man on the 1st floor, gone. A decent family on the 3rd, all right, except that the man beat his wife every night and made such a row that no one could sleep, gone also. I put up notices, no one even looks at them. A few months ago It was the middle of December, the day of the last execution." "The 15th, then," said the hawker. "I cried it, so I know. It's my trade, that." "Very well, then, the 15th," resumed widow Masson. "On that day, then, I let the cellar to a man who said he was a wine merchant, and who paid a term in advance, seeing that I didn't know him, and wouldn't have lent him a farthing on the strength of his good looks. He was a little bit of a man, no taller than that," contemptuously holding out her hand, "and he had 2 round eyes which I didn't like at all. He certainly paid, he did that, but we are more than half through the second term, and I have no news of my tenant." "And have you never seen him since?" "Yes, once, no, twice, let's see, 3 times, I am sure. He came with a hand cart and a commissionaire, and he had a big chest taken downstairs, a case which he said contained wine bottles. No, he came before that with a workman, I think. Really, I don't know if it was before or after. Doesn't matter. Anyhow, it was bottled wine. The 3rd time he brought a mason, and I am sure they quarrelled. I heard their voices. He carried off the key, and I have seen neither him nor his wine again. I have another key, and I went down one day. Perhaps the rats have drunk the wine and eaten the chest, for there certainly is nothing there any more than there is in my hand now. Nevertheless, I saw what I saw, a big chest, very big, quite new, and corded all round with strong rope." "Now, what day was that?" asked the hawker. "What day? Well, it was no, I can't remember." "Nor I either. I am getting stupid. Let's have another little glass, shall we, just to clear our memories?" The expedient was not crowned with success. The memories failed to recover themselves. The crowd waited, attentive, as may be supposed. Suddenly the hawker exclaimed, "What a fool I am! I'm going to find that, if only I've still got it." She felt eagerly in the pocket of her underskirt and produced several pieces of dirty, crumpled paper. As she unfolded one after another, she asked, "A big chest, wasn't it?" "Yes, very big." "And quite new?" "Quite new." "And corded?" "Yes, I can see it now." "So can I. Good gracious! It was the day when I sold the history of Le Roi de Valine, the 1st of February. Yes, it was a Saturday. The next day was Sunday. That's it, Saturday, February 1st. Well, I know that chest too. I met your wine merchant on the Place du Louvre, and he wasn't precisely enjoying himself. One of his creditors wanted to seize the chest, the wine, the whole kettle of fish. A little man, isn't he? A scarecrow?" "Just so." "And has red hair?" "That's the man." "And looks a hypocrite?" "You've hit it exactly." "And he is a hypocrite, enough to make one shudder. No doubt he can't pay his rent. A thief, my dears, a beggarly thief, who set fire to his own cellar, and who accused me of trying to steal from him, while it was he who cheated me, the villain, out of a piece of 24 sous. It's lucky I turned up here. Well, well, we shall have some fun. Here's another little business on your hands, and you will have to say where that wine has got to, my dear gossip Derues." "Derues?" cried 20 voices all at once. "What? Derues, who is in prison?" "Why, that's Monsieur de Lamotte's man." "The man who killed Madame de Lamotte?" "The man who made away with her son? A scoundrel, my dears, who accused me of stealing, an absolute monster." "It is just a little unfortunate," said widow Masson, "that it isn't the man. My tenant calls himself Ducoudray. There's his name on the register." "Confound it, that doesn't look like it at all," said the hawker. "Now that's a bore. Oh yes, I have a grudge against that thief who accused me of stealing. I told him I should sell his history some day. When that happens, I'll treat you all round." As a foretaste of the fulfilment of this promise, the company disposed of a second bottle of liqueur, and becoming excited, they chattered at random for some time, but at length slowly dispersed, and the street relapsed into the silence of night. But a few hours later the inhabitants were surprised to see the two ends occupied by unknown people, while other sinister-looking persons patrolled it all night as if keeping guard. The next morning, a carriage escorted by police stopped at the widow Masson's door. An officer of police got out and entered a neighbouring house, whence he emerged a quarter of an hour later, with Monsieur de Lamotte leaning on his arm. The officer demanded the key of the cellar, which last December had been hired from the widow Masson by a person named Ducoudray, and went down to it with Monsieur de Lamotte and one of his subordinates. The carriage standing at the door, the presence of the commissioner Mutel, the chatter of the previous evening, had naturally aroused everybody's imagination. But this excitement had to be kept for home use. The whole street was under arrest, and its inhabitants were forbidden to leave their houses. The windows, crammed with anxious faces, questioning each other, in the expectation of something wonderful, were a curious sight, and the ignorance in which they remained, these mysterious preparations, these orders silently executed, doubled the curiosity and added a sort of terror. No one could see the persons who had accompanied the police officer. 3 men remained in the carriage, one guarded by the 2 others. When the heavy coach turned into the Rue de la Mortellerie, this man had bent towards the closed window and asked, "Where are we?" And when they answered him, he said, "I do not know this street. I was never in it." After saying this quite quietly, he asked, "Why am I brought here?" As no one replied, he resumed his look of indifference, and betrayed no emotion, neither when the carriage stopped, nor when he saw Monsieur de Lamotte enter the widow Masson's house. The officer reappeared on the threshold, and ordered Derues to be brought in. The previous evening, detectives, mingling with the crowd, had listened to the hawker's story of having met Derues near the Louvre, escorting a large chest. The police magistrate was informed in the course of the evening. It was an indication, a ray of light, perhaps the actual truth, detached from obscurity by chance gossip, and measures were instantly taken to prevent anyone either entering or leaving the street without being followed and examined. Mutel thought he was on the track, but the criminal might have accomplices also on the watch, who, warned in time, might be able to remove the proofs of the crime, if any existed. Derues was placed between 2 men who held each arm. A third went before, holding a torch. The commissioner, followed by men also carrying torches and provided with spades and pickaxes, came behind, and in this order they descended to the vault. It was a dismal and terrifying procession. Anyone beholding these dark and sad countenances, this pale and resigned man passing thus into these damp vaults illuminated by the flickering glare of torches, might well have thought himself the victim of illusion and watching some gloomy execution in a dream. But all was real, and when light penetrated this dismal charnel house, it seemed at once to illuminate its secret depths, so that the light of truth might at length penetrate these dark shadows, and that the voice of the dead would speak from the earth and the walls. "Wretch!" exclaimed Monsieur de Lamotte when he saw Derues appear. Is it here that you murdered my wife and my son?" Derues looked calmly at him and replied, "I beg you, sir, not to add insult to the misfortunes you have already caused. If you stood in my place and I were in yours, I should feel some pity and respect for so terrible a position. What do you want me, and why am I brought here?" He did not know the events of last evening, and could only mentally accuse the mason who had helped to bury the chest. He felt that he was lost, but his audacity never forsook him. "You are here in the first place to be confronted with this woman," said the officer, causing the widow Masson to stand opposite to him. "I do not know her." "But I know you, and know you well. It was you who hired this cellar under the name of Ducoudray." Derues shrugged his shoulders and answered bitterly, "I can understand a man being condemned to the torture if he is guilty, but that in order to accomplish one's mission as accuser, and to discover a criminal, false witnesses who can give no evidence should be brought 100 leagues, that the rabble should be roused up, that divers faces and imaginary names should be bestowed on an innocent man, in order to turn a movement of surprise or an indignant gesture to his disadvantage. All this is iniquitous, and goes beyond the right of judgment bestowed upon men by God. I do not know this woman, and no matter what she says or does, I shall say no more." Neither the skill nor threats of the police officer could shake this resolution. It was to no purpose that the widow Masson repeated and asseverated that she recognised him as her tenant Ducoudray, and that he had had a large case of wine taken down into the cellar. Derues folded his arms and remained as motionless as if he had been blind and deaf. The walls were sounded, the stones composing them carefully examined, the floor pierced in several places, but nothing unusual was discovered. Would they have to give it up? Already the officer was making signs to this effect, when the man who had remained at first below with Monsieur de Lamotte, and who, standing in shadow, had carefully watched Derues when he was brought down, came forward and, pointing to the recess under the stairs, said, "Examine this corner. The prisoner glanced involuntarily in this direction when he came down. I have watched him, and it is the only sign he has given. I was the only person who could see him, and he did not see me. He is very clever, but one can't be for ever on one's guard, and may the devil take me if I haven't scented the hiding place." "Wretch!" said Derues to himself. "Then you have had your hand on me for a whole hour, and amused yourself by prolonging my agony. Oh, I ought to have known it. I have found my master. Never mind, you shall learn nothing from my face, nor yet from the decaying body you will find. Worms and poison can only have left an unrecognisable corpse." An iron rod sunk into the ground encountered a hard substance some 4 feet below. 2 men set to work and dug with energy. Every eye was fixed upon this trench, increasing in depth with every shovelful of earth which the 2 labourers cast aside. Monsieur de Lamotte was nearly fainting, and his emotion impressed everyone except Derues. At length the silence was broken by the spades striking heavily on wood, and the noise made everyone shudder. The chest was uncovered and hoisted out of the trench. It was opened, and the body of a woman was seen, clad only in a chemise, with a red and white headband, face downwards. The body was turned over, and Monsieur de Lamotte recognised his wife, not yet disfigured. The feeling of horror was so great that no one spoke or uttered a sound. Derues, occupied in considering the few chances which remained to him, had not observed that, by the officer's order, one of the guards had left the cellar before the men began to dig. Everybody had drawn back, both from the corpse and the murderer, who alone had not moved, and who was repeating prayers. The flame of the torches placed on the ground cast a reddish light on this silent and terrible scene. Derues started and turned round on hearing a terrified cry behind him. His wife had just been brought to the cellar. The commissioner seized her with one hand, and taking a torch in the other, compelled her to look down on the body. "It is Madame de Lamotte!" she exclaimed. "Yes, yes," she answered, overwhelmed with terror. "Yes, I recognise her." Unable to support the sight any longer, she grew pale and fainted away. She and her husband were removed separately. One would have supposed the discovery was already known outside, for the people showered curses and cries of "Assassin" and "Poisoner" on the carriage which conveyed Derues. He remained silent during the drive, but before re-entering his dungeon, he said, "I must have been mad when I sought to hide the death and burial of Madame de Lamotte from public knowledge. It is the only sin I have committed, and innocent of aught else, I resign myself as a Christian to the judgment of God." It was the only line of defence which remained open to him, and he clung to it with the hope of imposing on the magistrates by redoubled hypocrisy and pious observances. But all this laboriously constructed scaffolding of lies was shaken to its base and fell away piece by piece. Every moment brought fresh and overwhelming revelations. He professed that Madame de Lamotte had died suddenly in his house, and that, fearing suspicion, he had buried her secretly. But the doctors called on to examine the body declared that she had been poisoned with corrosive sublimate and opium. The pretended payment was clearly an odious imposture, the receipt a forgery. Then, like a threatening spectre, rose another question, to which he found no reply, and his own invention turned against him. Why, knowing his mother was no more, had he taken young de Lamotte to Versailles? What had become of the youth? What had befallen him? Once on the track, the cooper with whom he had lodged on the 12th of February was soon discovered, and an Act of Parliament ordered the exhumation of the corpse buried under the name of Beaupre, which the cooper identified by a shirt which he had given for the burial. Derues, confounded by the evidence, asserted that the youth died of indigestion and venereal disease, but the doctors again declared the presence of corrosive sublimate and opium. All this evidence of guilt he met with assumed resignation, lamenting incessantly for Edouard, whom he declared he had loved as his own son. "Alas!" he said, "I see that poor boy every night, but it softens my grief to know that he was not deprived of the last consolations of religion. God, who sees me and who knows my innocence, will enlighten the magistrates, and my honour will be vindicated." The evidence being complete, Derues was condemned by sentence of the Châtelet, pronounced April 30th, and confirmed by Parliament May 5th. We give the decree as it is found in the archives. End of section 12. Reading by Tom Denham. Section 13 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 5, by Alexandre Dumas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Denham. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 5, by Alexandre Dumas. Section 13. This court, having considered the trial held before the Provost of Paris, or his deputy lieutenant at the Châtelet, for the satisfaction of the aforesaid deputy at the aforesaid Châtelet, at the request of the deputy of the King's Attorney General at the aforesaid court, summoner and plaintiff, against Antoine Francois Derues and Marie-Louise Nicolet, his wife, defendants and accused, prisoners in the prisons of the Conciergerie of the Palace at Paris, who have appealed from the sentence given at the aforesaid trial, the 30th day of April 1777, by which the aforesaid Antoine Francois Derues has been declared duly attainted and convicted of attempting unlawfully to appropriate without payment the estate of Buissonny-Souef, belonging to the Sieur and Dame de Saint-Faust de la Motte, from whom he had bought the said estate by private contract on the 22nd day of December 1775, and also of having unworthily abused the hospitality shown by him since the 16th day of December last towards the aforesaid Dame de la Motte, who arrived in Paris on the aforesaid day in order to conclude with him the bargain agreed on in December 1775, and who, for this purpose, and at his request, lodged with her son in the house of the said Derues, who, of premeditated design, poisoned the said Dame de la Motte, whether by a medicine composed and prepared by him on the 30th day of January last, or by the beverages and drinks administered by him after the aforesaid medicine, he having taken the precaution to send his servant into the country for 2 or 3 days, and to keep away strangers from the room where the said Dame de la Motte was lying, from the effects of which poison the said Dame de la Motte died on the night of the said 31st of January last, also of having kept her demise secret, and of having himself enclosed in a chest the body of the said Dame de la Motte, which he then caused to be secretly transported to a cellar in the Rue de la Mortellerie, hired by him for this purpose, under the assumed name of Ducoudray, wherein he buried it himself, or caused it to be buried. Also of having persuaded the son of the above Dame de la Motte, who with his mother had lodged in his house from the time of their arrival in Paris until the 15th day of January last, and who had then been placed in a school, that the aforesaid Dame de la Motte was at Versailles, and desired him to join her there, and under this pretence of having conducted the said younger Sieur de la Motte, the 12th day of February, after having given him some chocolate, to the aforesaid town of Versailles, to a lodging hired at a cooper's, and of having there wilfully poisoned him, either in the chocolate taken by the said younger Sieur de la Motte before starting, or in beverages and medicaments which the said Derues himself prepared, mixed, and administered to the aforesaid Sieur de la Motte the younger during the 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th days of February last, having kept him lying ill in the aforesaid hired rooms, and having refused to call in physicians or surgeons, notwithstanding the progress of the malady and the representations made to him on the subject, saying that he himself was a physician and surgeon, from which poison the said Sieur de Lamotte the younger died on the 15th day of February last, at 9 o'clock in the evening, in the arms of the aforesaid Derues, who, affecting the deepest grief and shedding tears, actually exhorted the aforesaid Sieur de Lamotte to confession, and repeated the prayers for the dying, after which he himself laid out the body for burial, saying that the deceased had begged him to do so, and telling the people of the house that he had died of venereal disease, also of having caused him to be buried the next day in the churchyard of the parish church of Saint Louis at the aforesaid Versailles, and of having entered the deceased in the register of the said parish under a false birthplace and the false name of Beaupre, which name the said Derues had himself assumed on arriving at the said lodging, and had given to the said Sieur de Lamotte the younger, whom he declared to be his nephew. Also, to cover these atrocities, and in order to appropriate to himself the aforesaid estate of Buisson-Souef, he is convicted of having calumniated the aforesaid Dame de Lamotte, and having used various manoeuvres and practised several deceptions, to wit: first, in signing or causing to be signed the names of the above Dame de Lamotte to a deed of private contract between the said Derues and his wife on one side, and the aforesaid Dame de Lamotte by right of a power of attorney given by her husband on the other, the which deed is dated the 12th day of February, and was therefore written after the decease of the said Dame de Lamotte. By which deed the said Dame de Lamotte appears to change the previous conventions agreed on in the first deed of the 22nd of December in the year 1775, and acknowledges receipt from the said Derues of a sum of 100,000 livres as being the price of the estate of Buisson. Secondly, in signing before a notary, the 9th day of February last, a feigned acknowledgment for a third part of 100,000 livres, in order to give credence to the pretended payment made by him. Thirdly, in announcing and publishing, and attesting even by oath at the time of examination before the Commissioner Mutel, that he had really paid in cash to the aforesaid Dame de Lamotte the aforesaid 100,000 livres, and that she, being provided with this money, had fled with her son and a certain person unknown. Fourthly, in depositing with a notary the deed of private contract, bearing the pretended receipt for the above sum of 100,000 livres, and pursuing at law the execution of this deed, and of his claim to the possession of the said estate. Fifthly, in signing or causing to be signed by another person before the notaries of the town of Lyons, whither he had gone for this purpose, a deed dated the 12th day of March, by which the supposed Dame de Lamotte appeared to accept the payment of the 100,000 livres, and to give authority to the Sieur de Lamotte, her husband, to receive the arrears of the remainder of the price of the said estate, the which deed he produced as a proof of the existence of the said Dame de Lamotte. Sixthly, in causing to be sent by other hands, under the name of the aforesaid Dame de Lamotte, to a lawyer on the 8th day of April 1777, at a time when he was in prison, and had been compelled to abandon the fable that he had paid the aforesaid sum of 100,000 livres in hard cash, and had substituted a pretended payment made in notes, the notes pretended to have been given by him in payment to the said Dame de Lamotte. Seventh, and finally, in maintaining constantly until the discovery of the body of the aforesaid Dame de Lamotte, that the said dame was still alive, and that he had seen her at the town of Lyons, as has been stated above. In atonement has been condemned, etc., etc., etc. His goods are hereby declared acquired and confiscated to the king, or to whomsoever his Majesty shall appoint, first deducting the sum of 200 livres as fine for the king, in case the confiscation is not to the sole profit of his Majesty, and also the sum of 600 livres for masses to be said for the repose of the souls of the aforesaid Dame de Lamotte and her son. And before being executed, the said Antoine Francois Derues shall suffer the question ordinary and extraordinary, in order that from his mouth may be learned the truth of these facts, and also the names of his accomplices. And the decision of the judges in the proceedings with regard to the above-mentioned Marie-Louise Nicolet, wife of Derues, is delayed until after the execution of the above sentence. It is also decreed that the mortuary act of the aforesaid de Lamotte the Younger, dated the 16th day of February last, in the register of deaths belonging to the parish church of Saint Louis at Versailles, be amended, and his correct names be substituted, in order that the said Sieur de Lamotte, the father, and other persons interested, may produce said names before the magistrates if required. And it is also decreed that this sentence be printed and published by the deputy of the Attorney General at the Châtelet, and affixed to the walls in the usual places and crossroads of the town, provostship, and viscounty of Paris, and wherever else requisite. With regard to the petition of Pierre Etienne de Saint-Faust de Lamotte, a royal equerry, Sieur de la Grange Flandre, Buisson-Souef, Valperfond, and other places, widower and inheritor of Marie-François Perrier, his wife, according to their marriage contract signed before Baron and partner, notaries at Paris, the 5th day of September 1762, whereby he desires to intervene in the action brought against Derues and his accomplices, concerning the assassination and poisoning committed on the persons of the wife and son of the said Sieur de Saint-Faust de Lamotte, on the accusation made by him to the Deputy Attorney General of the King at the Châtelet, at present pending in the court, on the report of the final judgment given in the said action the 30th of April last, and which allowed the intervention, it is decreed that there shall be levied on the goods left by the condemned before the rights of the Treasury, and separate from them, the sum of 6,000 livres, or such other sum as it shall please the court to award, from which sum the said Saint-Faust de Lamotte shall consent to deduct the sum of 2,748 livres, which he acknowledges has been sent or remitted to him by the said Derues and his wife at different times, which first sum of 6,000 livres, or such other, shall be employed by the said Sieur de Saint-Faust de Lamotte, who is authorised to found therewith in the parish church of Saint Nicolas de Villeneuve-le-Roi, in which parish the estate of Buisson-Souef is situate, and which is mentioned in the action, an annual and perpetual service for the repose of the souls of the wife and son of the said Sieur de Saint-Faust de Lamotte, of which an act shall be inserted in the decree of intervention, and a copy of this act or decree shall be inscribed upon a stone which shall be set in the wall of the said church of Saint Nicolas de Villeneuve-le-Roi, in such place as is expedient. And the deed of contract for private sale between the late spouse of the said Sieur de Saint-Faust de Lamotte and the above-named Derues and his wife, is hereby declared null and void, as having had no value in absence of any payment or realisation of contract before a notary, and the pretended agreement of the 12th day of February last, as also all other deeds fabricated by the said Derues or others named in the above action, as also any which may hereafter be presented, are hereby declared to be null and void. The court declares the judgment pronounced by the magistrates of the Châtelet against the above-named Derues to be good and right, and his appeal against the same to be bad and ill-founded. It is decreed that the sentence shall lose its full and entire effect with regard to Marie-Louise Nicolet, who is condemned to the ordinary fine of 12 livres. The necessary relief granted on the petition of Pierre Etienne de Saint-Faust de la Motte, the 2nd day of May this present month, and delay accorded until after the suspended judgment pronounced with regard to the said Marie-Louise Nicolet. Signed, de Gourgues, President. Outremont, Councillor. Derues' assurance and calmness never deserted him for one moment. For 3/4 of an hour he harangued the Parliament, and his defence was remarkable both for its presence of mind and the art with which he made the most of any circumstances likely to suggest doubts to the magistrates, and soften the severity of the first sentence. Found guilty on every point, he yet protested that he was innocent of poisoning. Remorse, which often merely means fear of punishment, had no place in his soul, and torture he seemed not to dread. As strong in will as he was weak in body, he desired to die like a martyr in the faith of his religion, which was hypocrisy, and the God whom he glorified on the scaffold was the God of lies. On May 6th, at 7 in the morning, the sentence of execution was read to him. He listened calmly, and when it was finished, remarked, "I had not anticipated so severe a sentence." A few hours later, the instruments of torture were got ready. He was told that this part of the punishment would be remitted if he would confess his crimes and the names of his accomplices. He replied, "I have no more to say. I know what terrible torture awaits me. I know I must die today, but I have nothing to confess." He made no resistance when his knees and legs were bound, and endured the torture courageously. Only in a moment of agony he exclaimed, "Accursed money! Hast thou reduced me to this?" Thinking that pain would overcome his resolution, the presiding magistrate bent towards him and said, "Unhappy man, confess thy crime, since death is near at hand." He recovered his firmness, and looking at the magistrate, replied, "I know it, monseigneur. I have perhaps not 3 hours to live." Thinking that his apparently feeble frame could not endure the last wedges, the executioner was ordered to stop. He was unbound and laid on a mattress, and a glass of wine was brought, of which he only drank a few drops. After this he made his confession to the priest. For dinner they brought him soup and stew, which he ate eagerly, and inquiring of the jailer if he could have something more, an entree was brought in addition. One might have thought that this final repast heralded not death, but deliverance. At length 3 o'clock struck, the hour appointed for leaving the prison. According to the report of credible persons whom we have consulted, Paris on this occasion presented a remarkable appearance, which those who saw it were never able to forget. The great ant-hill was troubled to its very lowest depth. Whether by accident or design, the same day had been fixed for a function which ought to have proved a considerable counter-attraction. A great festival in honour of a German prince was given on the Plaine de Grenelle, at which all the court was present, and probably more than one great lady regretted missing the emotions of the Place de Grève, abandoned to the rabble and the bourgeoisie. The rest of the city was deserted, the streets silent, the houses closed. A stranger transported suddenly into such a solitude might have reasonably thought that during the night the town had been smitten by the angel of death, and that only a labyrinth of vacant buildings remained, testifying to the life and turmoil of the preceding day. A dark and dense atmosphere hung over the abandoned town. Lightning furrowed the heavy motionless clouds. In the distance the occasional rumble of thunder was heard, answered by the cannon of the royal fete. The crowd was divided between the powers of heaven and earth, the terrible majesty of the Eternal on one side, on the other the frivolous pomp of royalty, eternal punishment and transient grandeur in opposition. Like the waters of a flood leaving dry the fields which they have covered, so the waves of the multitude forsook their usual course. Thousands of men and women crowded together along the route which the death cart would take. An ocean of heads undulated like the ears in a wheat field. The old houses, hired at high rates, quivered under the weight of eager spectators, and the window sashes had been removed to afford a better view. Attired in the shirt worn by condemned criminals, and bearing a placard both in front and behind with the words "Wilful Poisoner," Derues descended the great staircase of the Châtelet with a firm step. It was at this moment, on seeing the crucifix, that he exclaimed, "O Christ, I shall suffer like thee!" He mounted the tumbril, looking right and left amongst the crowd. During the progress he recognised and bowed to several of his old associates, and bade adieu in a clear voice to the former mistress of his prentice days, who has recorded that she never saw him look so pleasant. Arrived at the door of Notre Dame, where the clerk was awaiting him, he descended from the tumbril without assistance, took a lighted wax taper weighing 2 pounds in his hand, and did penance, kneeling, bareheaded and barefooted, a rope around his neck, repeating the words of the death warrant. He then reascended the cart in the midst of the cries and execrations of the populace, to which he appeared quite insensible. One voice only, endeavouring to dominate the tumult, caused him to turn his head. It was that of the hawker who was crying his sentence, and who broke off now and then to say, "Well, my poor gossip Derues, how do you like that fine carriage you're in? Oh yes, mutter your prayers and look up to heaven as much as you like. You won't take us in now. Ah, thief, who said I stole from you? Wasn't I right when I said I should be selling your sentence some day?" Then, adding her own wrongs to the list of crimes, she declared that the Parliament had condemned him as much for having falsely accused her of theft as for having poisoned Madame de Lamotte and her son. When arrived at the scaffold, he gazed around him, and a sort of shiver of impatience ran through the crowd. He smiled, and, as if anxious to trick mankind for the last time, asked to be taken to the Hôtel de Ville, which was granted, in the hope that he would at last make some confession. But he only persisted in saying that he was guiltless of poisoning. He had an interview with his wife, who nearly fainted on seeing him, and remained for more than a quarter of an hour unable to say a word. He lavished tender names upon her, and professed much affliction at seeing her in so miserable a condition. When she was taken away, he asked permission to embrace her, and took a most touching farewell. His last words have been preserved. "My dear wife," he said, "I recommend our beloved children to your care. Bring them up in the fear of God. You must go to Chartres. You will there see the bishop, on whom I had the honour of waiting when I was there last, and who has always been kind to me. I believe he has thought well of me, and that I may hope he will take pity on you and on our children." It was now 7 in the evening, and the crowd began to murmur at the long delay. At length the criminal reappeared. An onlooker who saw him go to the Hôtel de Ville, and who was carried by the movement of the crowd to the foot of the scaffold, says that when handed over to the executioner, he took off his clothes himself. He kissed the instrument of punishment with devotion, then extended himself on the St. Andrew's cross, asking with a resigned smile that they would make his sufferings as short as possible. As soon as his head was covered, the executioner gave the signal. One would have thought a very few blows would have finished so frail a being, but he seemed as hard to kill as the venomous reptiles which must be crushed and cut to pieces before life is extinct, and the coup de grâce was found necessary. The executioner uncovered his head, and showed the confessor that the eyes were closed and that the heart had ceased to beat. The body was then removed from the cross, the hands and feet fastened together, and it was thrown on the funeral pile. While the execution was proceeding, the people applauded. On the morrow they bought up the fragments of bone, and hastened to buy lottery tickets, in the firm conviction that these precious relics would bring luck to the fortunate possessors. In 1777, Madame Derues was sentenced to perpetual imprisonment, and confined at the Salpêtrière. She was one of the first victims who perished in the prison massacres. End of section 13. End of Derues.
Section 14, Celebrated Crimes, Volume 5, by Alexandre Dumas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Corey Matlack from Baltimore, Maryland. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 5, by Alexandre Dumas. Section 14, La Constantine, 1660. Chapter 1. Before beginning our story, we must warn the reader that it will not be worth his while to make researches among contemporary or other records as to the personage whose name it bears. For in truth neither Marie Leroux, widow of Jacques Constantin, nor her accomplice, Claude Perregaux, was of sufficient importance to find a place on any list of great criminals, although it is certain that they were guilty of the crimes with which they were charged. It may seem strange that what follows is more a history of the retribution which overtook the criminals than a circumstantial description of the deeds for which they were punished. But the crimes were so revolting, and so unsuitable for discussion that it was impossible for us to engage into any details on the subject. So that what we offer in these pages is, we confess quite openly, not a full, true, and particular account of a certain series of events leading up to a certain result. It is not even a picture wherein that result is depicted with artistic completeness. It is only an imperfect narrative, imperfectly rounded off. We feel sure, however, that the healthy-minded reader will be grateful for our reticence and total disregard of proportion, in spite of the disadvantage which such a theme imposes on any writer with a deep sense of responsibility. We have resolved to let in some light on these obscure figures. For we can only imagine no more effective way of throwing into high relief the low morals and deep corruption into which all classes of society had sunk at the termination of the factious dissensions of the Fronde, which formed such a fitting prelude to the license of the reign of the Grand Roi. After this explanation, we shall without further preamble introduce the reader into a little tavern in Paris, situated in the Rue Saint-André-des-Arts, on an evening in November 1658. It was about 7 o'clock. 3 gentlemen were seated at one of the tables in a low, smoky room. They had already emptied several bottles, and one of them seemed to have just suggested some madcap scheme to the others, the thought of which sent them into shouts of laughter. "Pardieu," said one of them, who was the first to recover his breath. "I must say it would be an excellent trick." "Splendid," said another. "And if you like, Commander de Jars, we can try it this very evening." "All right, my worthy king's treasurer, provided my pretty nephew here won't be too much shocked." And as he spoke, de Jars gave to the youngest of the 3 a caressing touch on the cheek with the back of his hand. "That reminds me, de Jars," said the treasurer. "That word you have just said piques my curiosity. For some months now, this little fellow here, Chevalier des Moranges, follows you about everywhere like your shadow. You never told us you had a nephew. Where the devil did you get him?" The commander touched the chevalier's knee under the table, and he, as if to avoid speaking, slowly filled and emptied his glass. "Look here," said the treasurer, "do you want to hear a few plain words, such as I shall rap out when God takes me to the task about the peccadilloes of my past life? I don't believe a word about the relationship. A nephew must be the son of either a brother or sister. Now your only sister is an abscess, and your late brother's marriage was childless. There is only one way of proving the relationship, and that is to confess that when your brother was young and wild, he and love met, or else Madame la abscess." "Take care, Treasurer Gianin. No slander against my sister." "Well then, explain. You can't fool me. May I be hanged if I leave this place before I've dragged the secret out of you. Either we are friends or we are not. What you tell no one else, you ought to tell me. What? Would you make use of my purse and sword on occasion, yet have secrets from me? It's too bad. Speak, or our friendship is at an end. I give you fair warning that I shall find out everything and publish it abroad to court and city. When I strike a tale, there is no turning me aside. It will be the best for you to whisper your secret voluntarily into my ear, where it will be as safe as in the grave." "How foul curiosity you are, my good friend," said de Jars, leaning one elbow on the table and twirling the points of his mustache with his hand. "But if I were to wrap my secret round the point of a dagger, would you not be too much afraid of pricking your fingers to pull it off?" "Not I," said the king's treasurer, beginning to twirl his mustache also. "The doctors have always told me that I am of too full a complexion, and that it would do me all the good in the world to be bled now and then. But what would be an advantage to me would be dangerous to you. It's easy to see from your jaundiced phiz that for you, bloodletting is no cure." "And you would really go to that length? You would risk a duel if I refused to let you get to the bottom of my mystery?" "Yes, on my honor. Well, how's it to be?" "My dear boy," said de Jars to the youth, "we are caught, and may as well yield gracefully. You don't know this big fellow as well as I do. He's obstinacy itself. You can make the most obstinate donkey go on by pulling its tail hard enough. But when Gianin gets a notion into his plate, not all the legions of hell can get it out of him again. Besides that, he's a skillful fencer, so there's nothing for it but to trust him." "Just as you like," said the young man. "You know all my circumstances, and how important it is that my secret should be kept." "Oh, among Giannon's many vices there are a few virtues, and of these discretion is the greatest, so that his curiosity is harmless. A quarter of an hour hence he will let himself be killed, rather than reveal what just now he is ready to risk his skin to find out, whether we will it or no." Giannon nodded approvingly, refilling the glasses, and raising his to his lips said in a tone of triumph, "I am listening, Commander." "Well, if it must be, it must. First of all, learn that my nephew is not my nephew at all." "Go on." "That his name is not Moranges." "And the next?" "I'm not going to reveal his real name to you." "Why not?" "Because I don't know it myself, and no more does the Chevalier." "What nonsense!" "No nonsense at all, but the sober truth. A few months ago the Chevalier came to Paris, bringing me a letter of introduction from a German whom I used to know years ago. This letter requested to me to look after the bearer and help him in his investigations. As you said just now, love and someone once met somewhere, and that was about all was known as to his origin. Naturally, the young man wants to cut a figure in the world, and would like to discover the author of his existence, that he may have someone at hand to pay the debts he is going to incur. We have brought together every scrap of information we could collect as to this person, hoping to find therein a clue that we could follow up. To be quite open with you, and convince you at the same time how extremely prudent and discreet we must be, I must tell you that we think we have found one, and it leads to no less a dignitary than the Prince of the Church. But if he should get wind of our researches too soon, everything would be at an end. Don't you see? So keep your tongue between your teeth." "Never fear," said Giannon. "Now that's what I call speaking out as a friend should. I wish you luck, my gallant Chevalier de Moranges. And until you unearth your father, if you want a little money, my purse is at your service. On my word, de Jars, and you must have been born with a call. There never was your equal for wonderful adventures. This one promises well spicy intrigues, scandalous revelations, and you'll be in the thick of it all. You're a lucky fellow. It's only a few months since you had the most splendid piece of good fortune sent you straight from heaven. A fair lady falls in love with you and makes you carry her off from the convent of La Roquette. But why do you never let anyone catch a glimpse of her? Are you jealous? Or is that she is no such beauty after all, but old and wrinkled like that knave of a Mazarin?" "I know what I'm about," answered de Jars, smiling. "I have my very good reasons. The elopement caused a great deal of indignation, and it's not easy to get fanatics to listen to common sense. No, I'm not in the least jealous. She is madly in love with me. Ask my nephew." "Does he know her?" "We have no secrets from each other. The confidence between us is without a flaw. The fair one, believe me, is good to look on, and is worth all the ogling, fan-flirting baggages put together that one sees at court or on the balconies of the Palais Roy. I'll answer for that, isn't she, Moranges?" "I'm quite of your opinion," said the youth, exchanging with de Jars a singularly significant look. "And you had better treat her well, uncle, or I shall play you some trick." "Aha!" cried Giannon. "You poor fellow! I very much fear that you are warming a little serpent in your bosom. Have an eye for this dandy with the beardless chin. But joking apart, my boy, are you really on good terms with the fair lady?" "Certainly I am." "And you are not uneasy, Commander?" "Not the least little bit." "He is quite right. I answer for her as for myself, you know. As long as he loves her, she will love him. As long as he is faithful, she will be faithful. Do you imagine a woman who insists on her lover carrying her off so easily turn away from the man of her choice? I know her well. I have had long talks with her, she and I alone. She is feather-brained, given to pleasure, entirely without prejudices, and those stupid scruples which spoil the lives of other women, but a good sort on the whole, devoted to my uncle with no deception about her, but at the same time extremely jealous, and has no notion of letting herself be sacrificed to a rival. If ever she finds herself deceived, goodbye to prudence and reserve. And then... A look and touch of the commander's knee cut this panegyric short, to which the treasurer was listening with open-eyed astonishment. "What enthusiasm!" he exclaimed. "Well, and then?" "Why, then," went on the young man with a laugh, "if my uncle behaves badly, I, his nephew, will try to make up for his wrongdoing. He can't blame me then, but until then he may be quite uneasy, as he well knows." "Ah, yes, and in proof of that I'm going to take Moranges with me tonight. He is young and inexperienced, and it'll be a good lesson for him to see how a gallant whose amorous intrigues did not begin yesterday sets about getting even with a coquette. He can turn it to account later on." "On my word," says Jeannin, "my notion is that he is in no great need of a teacher. However, that's your business, not mine. Let us return to what we were talking about just now. Are we agreed? And shall we amuse ourselves by paying out the lady in her own coin?" "If you like." "Which of us is to begin?" Dejar struck the table with the handle of his dagger. "More wine, gentlemen?" said the drawer, running up. "No dice, and be quick about it." "3 casts each other, and the highest wins," said Jeannin. "You begin." "I throw for myself and nephew."
The dice rolled on the table.
"Ace and 3. It's my turn now. 6 and 5. "Pass it over. 5 and 2.
"We're equal. 4 and 2.
"Now let me. Ace and blank."
"Double 6.
"You have won."
"And I'm off at once," said Jeannin, rising and muffling himself in his mantle. "It's 7:30. We shall see each other again at 8. So I won't say goodbye."
"Good luck to you."
Leaving the tavern and turning into the Rue Pavée, he took the direction of the river. End of section 14.